Meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 70 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Accounts.
1082, and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, April 24th, 2023. The committee resumes its study of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation. I'd now like to welcome our witnesses. Yes, Madame Sinclair-Desgagne.
Monsieur le Président, j'aimerais avoir une confirmation.
Mr. Chair, I would like you to confirm something. I'm seeking confirmation from you and from the clerks on part of the procedure of the House of Commons. Normally, that's what it says. Witnesses appearing before House committees don't have to swear, and it's generally understood that they have the duty to speak the truth, whether or not they have been sworn in. Many testimonies are protected by parliamentary privilege. If a committee determines that a witness has lied or misled the committee, it could be sent to the House. If the House determines that the witness has lied, it could be found guilty of contempt, whether or not they were sworn in or not.
Oui, ça c'est correct, Madame Sinclair-Desgagne. Thank you. I will continue here. I'd now like to welcome our witnesses. We have 5 today. Anita Biguzs, thank you for coming, who is retired from the Federal Public Service. Mr. Graham Flack, who is currently Secretary of the Treasury Board of Canada and is also the former Deputy Minister of Canadian Heritage. Daniel Zhang, bonjour, former Deputy Minister, ancien sous-ministre.
Former Deputy Minister.
Who's joining us by video conference, former Deputy Minister, and Mr. Maurice Rosenberg, a retired Deputy Minister as well. I believe I have opening statements. I'm expecting them from 2 individuals, Mr. Newbley, Mr. Rosenberg. If others have opening statements, just flag to me, and I'll be happy to include you. If you could limit your opening remarks to 5 minutes, although you'll find I'm a flexible chair, and if you do go over, I won't bang the gavel because I don't like to cut off witnesses. I'm going to begin with Mr. Newbley. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Sure, Mr. Chair. Thank you for having me today. I was advised in advance of this meeting that I needed opening remarks. However, so I will be brief. My name's John Newbley, former Deputy Minister of Industry and ISED. I served in the role from 2012 to 2019. And of course, I'm speaking as an individual today, not a representative of the department or government. I will do my best to assist the committee based on my recollection of the facts. The Trudeau Foundation is an agency that was, and I believe continues to be, part of the ministry's broad portfolio of organizations. During my time, the responsibility of monitoring its activities fell to the science sector or branch in the department, and I believe it still does. I believe I was always briefed that the foundation was designed at the outset in 2001 to be an independent standalone agency, and consistent with the Not-for-Profit Act, the board therefore has responsibility for oversight of its own operations with a fiduciary responsibility. The science sector at ISED or industry derived its mandate for monitoring the Trudeau Foundation from its role for supporting excellence in universities, scholars, and research activities across the country. I understand the committee has questions about a meeting of deputy ministers and Trudeau Foundation scholars at the Privy Council office in 2016. What I recall, and this is based on my memory, was that I was invited to the meeting. However, I also remember I chose not to attend as other priorities arose. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rosenberg, the floor is now yours, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I served under both Conservative and Liberal governments for 15 years as Deputy Minister of Justice, Health and Foreign Affairs. Since retiring from the public service, I've served as President of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, as an advisor on policy and on various boards. I wish to first address my presence at a meeting when I was President of the Foundation with public servants that occurred in April 2016 in the Langevin Bloc. One of the reasons that I agreed to serve at the Foundation is my belief that there's a public interest in strengthening exchanges between academic researchers and policymakers. Academic research should be known to policymakers, and as a deputy minister, I often reached out to and met with academics. It's equally important that academics be exposed to the practical realities of policymaking. At the foundation, one of our fellows and one of our mentors had begun a project in early 2016 to determine whether there were economic benefits to diversity. I knew that diversity and pluralism was a priority for the government at the time, and I suggested to a deputy secretary at the Privy Council office that a meeting with officials would provide an opportunity to share perspectives on this issue. That's the genesis of the meeting that was reported on in the media, and the PCO invited the relevant officials. The media reports emphasized the fact that the meeting took place in the Langevin Bloc, which they thought was unusual because the Prime Minister's office is located there. That building not only serves as the Prime Minister's office, but also houses the Privy Council office, a part of the public service, and is a central downtown location for public servants and others to meet. Inviting people from outside government to meetings in this building is not unusual. Accordingly, there was nothing at all unusual about the April 2016 meeting in the Langevin Bloc. Next, I want to address 2 points that have been raised in relation to the 2016 donation issue. It's been alleged that the company to whom the tax receipt was issued, Millennium Golden Eagle Canada Inc., is a shell company. Have had a look at the Quebec government's Registre des Entreprises, and it points out that that company is a going concern in the business of hotels and inns and real property investment, and I can provide you with that document. Second, I wanted to provide some additional context to support the view expressed by Alexander Trudeau in the Access to Information Committee, by Ted Johnson, and by me, that the donation has to be assessed from the perspectives of relations with China in an era that's much different than the very negative one that we're in today. In the mid-2010s, Canadian universities, businesses, and governments all saw it as being in their interests to strengthen ties with China. And I think that Prime Minister Harper captured the spirit of the time well in 2013 when he welcomed 2 Chinese pandas to Toronto. He said, over the coming years, these pandas will help us learn more about one another while serving as a reminder of our deepening relationship, a relationship based on mutual respect and growing collaboration. It was a different time. There's been much concern expressed by some committee members that one of the 2 donors was president of the China Cultural Industry Association due to its association with the Chinese government. This was well understood at the time the donation was being negotiated. When the China Cultural Industry Association was established in 2013, Canada's ambassador to China wrote a congratulatory letter to the chairman and members of that organization. I have copies of that letter that I can provide to the committee, but I'd like to cite 3 brief excerpts. First, it's fortuitous that in many respects your objectives and efforts align well with ours at the Canadian Embassy in China. In fact, last year when Prime Minister Harper visited here, Canada and China agreed to hold a series of cultural activities in each other's countries in 2013 and 2014 in an effort to raise our bilateral engagement to a new level. The second quote, I'd like to note our deep gratitude to the CCIA's generous endowment to the University of Toronto's Faculty of Medicine via the establishment of the Bethune Fund. And finally, given your strong commitment to cultural cooperation and exchange, the CCIA will certainly serve as a leading platform for expanded Canada-China cultural collaboration. We look forward to working closely with your association over the coming months and years. We have confidence that our government's representative in China had Canada's interests at heart when he wrote this letter. The China Cultural Industry Association was viewed as a positive collaborator by the Harper government. These were indeed very different times. Within this context of warming relations, we believe that the donors were motivated by a genuine desire to pay tribute to Pierre Elliott Trudeau's legacy and their willingness to support the Foundation's program of policy conferences. Conferences on the implications of the rise of China were consistent with our core themes of Canada in the world and human rights. The donors had no say on the content of these conferences, an important consideration for the Foundation. We never thought that a $200,000 donation for conferences could or would influence any government. At no time did the donors ask the Foundation to connect them with government officials or anything else. The foundation never coordinated its activities with elected officials, neither prior to nor after the 2015 election. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rosenberg. I'll now turn to our first line of questioning. Mr. Brock, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for your appearance today. Largely, Mr. Rosenberg, you're going to be the beneficiary of all my questions today. On May the 2nd, you appeared before the Ethics Committee, and you were asked by a Liberal member of that committee at that time as to whether or not there's been any interference by the government and the Prime Minister in connection with the donation that we're talking about. Your response was, I'm not aware of any communication with the Prime Minister, his office, or other bodies within the government regarding this matter. And further on, that same Liberal member, actually it wasn't a Liberal member, it was an NDP member, Mr. Green, asked you this question. Ms. Fournier stated that she remembers reviewing emails between the Executive Director, Ellis Comtois, and the PMO. Were you aware of those emails? Your response, I don't recall, but I will say, just to go back, that if there were emails and there were documents that raised questions about this stuff, why didn't the foundation management call me to at least get my view on it so I could see the stuff? So I just want to ask you a few questions regarding those statements, because firstly, I find it incredible that you would say to the committee that you weren't aware of any sort of communication happening between the foundation and the Prime Minister's office, the PMO, specifically when Pascale Fournier indicated that there were numerous emails going on between the foundation and the PMO. Now, in terms of the organization chart, Ms. Ellis Comtois was the executive director, and she reported directly to you as president of the foundation, correct? Correct. Right. So I'm looking at one of those emails dated November the 24th, 2016, from Ellis Comtois directly to Zita Astravaz, a executive member of the Prime Minister's office, and it starts off by follows. Hi, Zita, as requested by the PMO. Please find below the key facts that we have been providing to the media who have contacted us regarding the $200,000 donation from Bin Zhang and New Ginshing. And you're saying to us, to the committee then, as you're probably going to say to me now, that you were absolutely not aware of that particular piece of communication.
I don't believe that piece of communication was in the package, the access package. Certainly, I was not aware of it at the time that I gave this testimony. I think I said it was possible that there was communication, asking...
Sir, with all due respect, you didn't say it was possible. You said you weren't aware, and that you were shocked that if there were communication, why wasn't it brought to your attention? So I'm asking the obvious question that everyone has here, really, what is going on at the foundation that a person in the title of executive director who has to report directly to you is communicating directly with the PMO? Let's remember, the Prime Minister is on record, as well as his government, numerous times stating in the House that there was a firewall at all times between he and the government and the foundation. This strikes definitely against that particular narrative. So why was that happening, and why were you not aware?
First of all, this happened 8 years ago. Second of all, part of my answer was, if there were records at the foundation that demonstrated this, why in the weeks leading up to the resignations did nobody contact me? Madame Fournier was not at the foundation while these events happened. I was. But I had no idea what was going on at the foundation, and I would have...
Well,
that is your view, and I disagree with it. I was at the foundation rather than, deciding to, I don't know why they resigned. I think it would have been helpful if someone had called me and said, can you come in and talk about this? Because I think there is a very innocent set of explanations for everything that went on in relation to this donation.
Okay, sir, I got to move on. Thank you. As well, Pascale Fournier testified at the Ethics Committee. She said, quote, her predecessor, Morris Rosenberg, told the National Post in December 2016 that the foundation didn't consider the donation to be foreign money because it was made by a company incorporated in Canada. She told MPs that this was actually a statement in the annual report when in fact the tax receipt itself mentions China. Her belief, I think this is something that is misleading to Canadians. Now, with respect to the documentation that this committee or other committees have actually received from the foundation, I was privy to a business banking statement from the foundation. This is the Bank of Montreal, and this is in regards to the first installment that was received on July the 25th, 2016. And I would well imagine your response is going to be, well, I'm the president. I didn't see these statements, so I took it at face value that this was a Canadian donation, when in fact it's clearly spelt out, Mr. Rosenberg, that on July the 25th, this was an international donation, clearly stated in black and white, international donation credit to the credit of the foundation at the Bank of Montreal for $70,000. You're not aware of this particular banking statement, is that correct, sir?
Particular banking statement. I don't believe it was part of the package. And if I could just, answer, because there was an allegation about discrepancies between the name of the, on the tax receipt and the name that was put into the annual report. And I was basically accused of misleading Canadians in this regard. And I'd like to know what's the nature of the deception. We acknowledged that two wealthy Chinese businessmen, instead of a corporate vehicle through which they made the payment, actually were instrumental in this. And I think we did this in a way that was more transparent than if we put the name of the Millennium Corporation into the report. The annual report is very forthright about the fact that there are Chinese donors behind the donation. And at the same
Mr. Brock, I'm afraid that is your time. Mr. Rosenberg, I think we're going to pick this up again. I appreciate it. We're going to turn now to Mr. Sidhu. Mr. Sidhu, you're joining us virtually. Good to see you, sir. You have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to our witnesses for taking the time to be with us here this morning. Mr. Rosenberg, I'd like to start off by thanking you for your service to Canada. For those watching these proceedings at home, it's important to note that Mr. Rosenberg has served in very senior positions as Deputy Minister and other senior positions in both Conservative and Liberal-led governments, including as Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Rosenberg has also received the Order of Canada for 2015 for his commitment to our country, and I know many members on this committee are grateful for your service. Mr. Rosenberg, my question is directed to you. As someone who has been involved with the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation for a number of years, would you be able to provide a summary of the Foundation's mandate and how its mandates and operations have evolved over the years? I think it's important for those listening to know this.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, the Foundation has been in operation since the early 2000s. I believe that Mr. Johnson was at this committee the other day and said that it has spent over $90 million supporting PhD scholars and academic fellows. It's a unique program that brings together some of the most brilliant scholars in the humanities and social sciences, senior academics, as well as people from outside the academic world, so that you have a kind of an intergenerational, intersectoral, and interdisciplinary approach. The way the Foundation has evolved, at least when I was there, I thought it was very important that while we gave out very generous scholarships that really enabled these PhD candidates to do well with respect to their studies, I thought that the value added of the Foundation would be their exposure to people from different walks of life and their exposure to Canada. And so we made a very significant effort every year to get people out to remote places in the country to meet people who were not academics, to meet ordinary Canadians, business people, students. We had a program where we had scholars and fellows going into high schools, talking to high school students about their research in a way that they could understand, and also as a way of getting some people to dream a little bit about what they themselves might accomplish, because a lot of our scholars came from very disadvantaged backgrounds. We had one who was homeless and almost landed in prison, and pulled his life together and became a PhD student at the University of Toronto. I believe he was mentioned at another committee, Jesse Thistle. There's another one whose family came from Ghana when he was 8 years old, very, very poor, living, really in social housing in Toronto. When he grew up, he ended up with a PhD in history from Yale, taught at Harvard, and is now teaching at McGill, and has just won an award for the best teacher. So there are some really inspiring stories coming out of the foundation. It has been, I think it's done stellar work. One of the other things that we wanted to do was to ensure that the scholars we had understood how government worked. So we had the opportunity to meet with public servants, with people in the Library of Parliament to learn how to engage with Parliament, for example, and to provide really a rounding experience for them. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you for that, and thanks for the details in your response. In terms of you spoke about people from all walks of life. Now, when a scholarship recipient is vetted by the foundation, are they vetted according to their partisan or ideological leanings? Is that taken into account?
Not at all.
Okay, good to know. And how many students have been supported by this foundation and the wonderful work that the foundation does?
I am not 100% sure. Mr. Johnson had the number at his fingertips last week. I think it was something like 290, but I'm not sure.
Thank you. In terms of the $125 million endowment, is that the primary source of the foundation's revenue? Is there other sources of revenue?
The primary source is indeed the endowment, and of course the conditions under which it received the endowment is that it can't spend the capital, it has to live off the interest. I know, again, Mr. Johnson mentioned last week that the capital has now increased to somewhere around $147,000, I believe. And in addition to that, there are some donations, but not many. The biggest donation was one made by the McCauley Foundation back in about 2016.
Thank you. And how big was that donation?
I think overall it was about $3 million, but I'm not sure.
Okay. And my last question to you, sir, is in regards to when the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation was created, did all political parties support the creation of this foundation?
I believe that all parties other than the Bloc Quebecois.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Madame Sinclair-Desgagne.
Now, Ms. Sinclair-Desgagne, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. My question goes to Mr. Rosenberg. Good morning to all witnesses. Do you remember, from what I understand, do you remember signing tax receipts for the donations that were transferred on several occasions by Millennium Golden Eagle?
Connect.
I know that I signed, but I do not remember. I'll explain this. Maybe I'll speak in English.
Why no red flags were raised when I signed the receipt with a Chinese address? And from the documents that were released under access to information, it would appear that no concerns were raised by the employees preparing the receipts, and no concerns were raised by me either, so how could that be? So first, the foundation has controls in place to deal with this very administrative matter of signing receipts, and I rely on them. But secondly, the way the questions have been asked, it's as though there's an expectation that I would have blocked off a significant amount of time to examine the receipts from this donation. And while I can't reproduce the exact circumstances, it was more likely someone saying to me, here's a pile of correspondence for your signature, and I would have quickly gone through it, focusing my attention more on the content of letters that we were sending out rather than on a receipt.
Monsieur Rosenberg, vous êtes avocat, vous
Mr. Rosenberg, you are a lawyer. You know you cannot sign a document before you read it. That's a basic law principle. I did not say I did not read it. I am saying that in an organization, we must establish priorities. I know that other things were happening at that time. Did I take all the time necessary to look at every document in detail? Maybe not. Next question, which falls in line with what you've just said. In Ms. Fournier's testimony, it was very clear that Trudeau Foundation employees received directives on who to send receipts. I read that in the document, and the way I interpret that is that we already know that there's a link between Mr. Zhang and the China Cultural Industry Association. Those employees were employees of that association. And I think that it was a question of having someone who was able to liaise with us in English. And two things were done. First of all, there were correspondences between the employees of the foundation and this person in China to do with translating the letter of thanks that I sent to the donor. In Mandarin, this person spoke English, but you sent a letter in Mandarin. Is this something that happens to you a lot in your career? Apparently, you're the one who signed the letter. I signed it because I was sure that the content of the letter was an exact translation of what we had drafted in English. It was a question of giving something to the donor that he could understand. He doesn't understand English. So there was a correspondence concerning the translation and concerning the address. But Mr. Rosenberg, this is a company that is Canadian, and it's not a shell company as you stated in your opening remarks. Why did you send them a letter in Mandarin? It's a Canadian company. Normally you should write to them in the language of the company. No, I think that the receipt was sent to the company. The letter was sent to Mr. Zhang. Very well. So you agree with me that the tax receipts, well, are you telling me now that the donor is someone who only spoke Mandarin, but the donation was provided by Millennium Golden Eagle? I'm sorry, it seems very unclear to me. Millennium Golden Eagle, was it the Canadian company? Why were you thanking a third party who only spoke Mandarin? I think that question may have been raised in a committee with Alexandre Trudeau. What I understand is that it's not useless to have someone who controls a company to pay the money. That is what happened. I must say that all these questions, well, I received many questions on the address, on the identity of the donors, and I am not able to give you exactly what happened, sincerely. But if there are any concerns, those are the types of things that could be addressed by an independent inquiry or an investigation by the Canada Revenue Agency. Do you agree that we should have a public and independent inquiry? Let me establish the distinction. There's the main issue of the public inquiry on foreign interference. Now, I think Mr. Desjarlais asked Mr. Johnson the other day if the Trudeau Foundation should be included in that. Let's be specific. Do you agree? You just mentioned that we need to have a public and independent inquiry, particularly. Well, you're a lawyer. You've worked for 34 years in the public service. The appearance of conflict of interest is more important than real conflict of interest. So in this case, we have to clear any doubt that exists to make sure that our democracy works well. Do you agree? Supplementary answer, Mr. Rosenberg. I agree, but not necessarily with the fact that we need this inquiry as we do the main inquiry on foreign interference. Let me explain. I think it's important for the Trudeau Foundation and for the reputation of the Trudeau Foundation to have more rapid answers than the time it would take to organize a public inquiry. I know that the foundation has started a process with the office of an independent lawyer. It's not up to me to decide, but I know that the details could be resolved in the near future because for the foundation, it's essential.
For 6 minutes, please. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to also thank the witnesses for being present, in particular, Mr. Rosenberg. I do apologize for not being there in person. I'm just getting over a bit of a sinus issue, but I do want to follow up a bit on my colleague from the Bloc Quebecois questioning. She did mention, and I'm sure that you've seen in past, my questions to one of your former colleague, Edward Johnson. And I'm certain that you could probably anticipate some of my questions in relation to the public inquiry or a need for at least an independent inquiry that I was pleased to hear that you recommended in just your answers to one of my colleagues. And that's where I'll focus a bit of my attention on, because of course, Mr. Rosenberg, you've worked in the public service, you've worked for Canadians, and I do appreciate that service. And I want to extend my remarks on behalf of myself as well for that service. But I do want to get your advice and your knowledge and your experience in relation to how we combat this kind of perception of foreign interference. If that is a perception that, for example, in my own perspective, is one that needs to have a public inquiry for the purpose of trying to combat the perspectives of a weakening democracy. And I think that's something Canadians right across the country feel as well. And so I'll focus my questions directly on the need to address foreign interference and the role that the Trudeau Foundation has played, or at least in the media has played, to damaging the perception of our democracy in ways that we can actually get past this in a credible way to ensure that Canadians can rebuild that confidence. I think that's an important project and one worthwhile, and one that I think this committee could assist in. And so your former colleague, Edward Johnson, I asked him just last week whether he would support a call by the Auditor General to investigate the Trudeau Foundation. He responded positively and said that he actually, as a matter of fact, sent a letter to the Auditor General at that time to request an audit. It was received by our committee, and we received a letter from the Auditor General that made clear she was unable to do that. In reference to that fact, I tabled a motion that called on the CRA, the Canadian Revenue Agency, to begin an investigation from this committee. It passed, and I was pleased to see that. And I was pleased to hear your remarks in relation to this. Do you still agree that the CRA should investigate the Trudeau Foundation?
So I think, the CRA decides what it's going to do. I saw briefly some of the testimony from CRA senior officials here. And I think Mr. Johnson said that, okay, if the CRA wants to look at the Trudeau Foundation, that would be probably desirable at this point, because there's been so much noise and so much smoke raised about this that there's got to be some sort of a process to sort it out. And with all due respect, it's not going to happen at a parliamentary committee. There's just a lot of partisanship within a parliamentary committee. It's going to have to be another process. CRA is one way of doing it, and I'm not saying they're mutually exclusive. What the Trudeau Foundation is trying to do now with an independent forensic audit with a firm they have no association with, as I understand, is another way of doing it. There are discussions that are ongoing now, I read the newspapers, between representatives of all the political parties on what is the way forward after Mr. Johnson's resignation. And I really hope, and I wonder whether, given some of the issues, I'm not saying the Trudeau Foundation issue doesn't need to be looked at, it absolutely does. But there are a lot of issues that need to be looked at in terms of foreign interference, bullying, intimidation of expat populations, hostage diplomacy, trade sanctions, and the kind of censorship practices that have been alleged that have been carried out by the Confucius Foundation, which are quite different than what we were looking at in terms of this gift to put on conferences. That we could have put on a conference about Tiananmen Square, and these guys would not have had a word to say about it. I actually think, it's a pretty weird influence operation, because it likely would have ended up embarrassing the Chinese.
Interesting.
Because,
Mr. Rosenberg,
sorry.
Please finish. Sorry, you can finish that.
They started off saying, let's do scholarships. Scholarships are a much lower risk proposition than conferences. And even if the conferences had had a benign name, I know the people in the Trudeau Foundation, they would not have let human rights go. They would not have let climate change go. you would have had a very robust discussion, and it's not something the Chinese would have wanted to hear. So I thought, this is actually great.
Interesting. You know, I think, Mr. Rosenberg, it's those ideas aside, I think it's important that a public independent inquiry. You know, you mentioned an independent inquiry, which I agree with. I believe in a public independent inquiry. And so when I asked Mr. Johnson that question, he responded that he doesn't believe a public inquiry was something that he would agree with. Do you agree with Mr. Johnson about that?
I think my main point is I would like to see whatever is done with respect to the Trudeau Foundation done quickly, because I think the Trudeau Foundation needs certainty to be able to move ahead. We are discussing this in public. This is, you know, this committee.
But in all due respect, Mr. Rosenberg, I think it's, you know, the Trudeau Foundation, what it and its needs are independent of what Canadians need. And so your request for a quick time for that investigation is something that doesn't fall to me as something that's an important aspect to why this public inquiry is so important. I believe in public inquiry is important, not because of the expediency required by the Trudeau Foundation in order to continue its business. It's important because Canadians, Mr. Rosenberg, need to have confidence, robust confidence in our democratic system. And so that is why I believe in a public independent inquiry. And so I understand the work by Mr. Johnson to have his own commission on that, but it's something that I still believe is important, and it's something that I'll continue to ask you in my follow-up about why you believe a public inquiry is something that's so different than an independent inquiry and why you won't agree.
Mr. Rosenberg, if you have a brief response, I'll hear it, please.
I want to acknowledge you've been very passionate about this. Virtually all your questions to Ted Johnson were about this. And in the final analysis, it's not the Trudeau Foundation that's going to decide how this is going to go forward. This is something that will be decided. The content of the large public inquiry is going to be decided in discussions between the leaders of all of the, or the representatives of all of the parties. So we'll see where it comes out. If it happens that it's part of a public inquiry, then the Trudeau Foundation will deal with it.
Thank you very much. Turning now to our next round, Mr. Brock, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Rosenberg, would you agree with me that the Foundation prides itself on its highest ethical and moral standards? Yes. Okay. You'd agree with me, sir, that in the last couple of years, that perception has been rocked a little bit. Firstly, we have the Beijing influence, we have the questionable donation to the foundation, and most recently we've got a $1.25 million lawsuit launched by a former scholar of the foundation involving a mentor. You'd agree with me that that sort of compromises its overall image?
It's certainly not helpful.
No. So, Mr. Rosenberg, I'd like to ask you some questions. This lawsuit was launched March 31st, 2022. I understand the foundation has yet to file a defense. Is that your understanding?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Because I'm not a defendant in this lawsuit.
I see. And to your knowledge, sir, is there a concurrent criminal investigation as well?
I have no knowledge of that.
Okay. Now, I'm going to ask you some questions regarding some of the commentary within the statement of claim itself. According to the plaintiff, she reports the harassment to the foundation and is immediately disbelieved. Specifically, sir, she brought this to your attention June the 11th, 2018. You contacted her, requested to speak with her in relation to the allegation. June 22nd, you spoke by phone. During the call, you accused the plaintiff of, quote, blowing things out of proportion. You questioned her about the incidents, demanding to know if it was a, quote, familiar squeeze, a sexual squeeze, or a caress. Do you recall making that statement?
Are you reading from the plaintiff's statement of claim?
I am indeed.
To which no defense has yet been filed?
I'm asking, do you acknowledge?
No, I do not.
Do you acknowledge speaking with the plaintiff?
I do.
In and around that time frame regarding this allegation?
Yes.
All right.
But I
so
don't.
You deny telling her that you did not believe her, or
Absolutely.
questioning her with respect to the allegations.
I asked her, but I certainly didn't deny that I didn't deny what she was saying.
Okay. Do you deny that the foundation, including several board members, pressured this plaintiff in signing a non-disclosure agreement, not once, but on 2 occasions?
I can't speak to that because I believe that those things happened after I left the foundation.
Okay. And during the time that you were the president of the foundation, because you signed the agreement between this particular plaintiff and the mentor, I understand that there was no sexual harassment policy in place at the foundation. Is that correct?
That's correct. There were no sexual harassment policies in a lot of organizations as we started
I'm
to
not talking
learn
about other
more.
organizations, sir. With all due
I'm-
respect,
yes,
I'm
I answered
talking
your
about
question.
the
Point of
Trudeau
order, Chair.
Foundation.
I answered your question.
Yes, Ms. Shanahan.
This is outside the scope of this study, and I think it's very inappropriate for this line of questioning to continue. This is not a courtroom. This is a committee, and I believe it's entirely inappropriate.
Mr. Genuis, I can, thank you. So, Ms. Shannon, I'm the questions are being asked forcefully but respectfully. Mr. Rosenberg is answering them. I'm going to continue to allow Mr. Brock his line of questioning. As you know, I give members latitude to ask questions, provided they are respectful. So, Mr. Brock, you have the floor again.
So, before I was interrupted, sir, on a point of order, which was not really a point of order, I asked you about focusing in your responses to the foundation. Now, you signed the agreement. There was no sexual harassment policy for the scholar and no sexual harassment policy for the mentor, correct?
There was no sexual harassment policy, correct.
And do you acknowledge that the foundation is doing everything within its legal mandate to block this case from being heard? It was originally brought in British Columbia. Then it was brought to Newfoundland, where the allegations are allegedly to have occurred. And now you're suggesting, or at least the foundation is suggesting, that this be litigated in the province of Quebec. Do you acknowledge the foundation is doing that to her as well?
I have not worked for the foundation since 2018, and I am not familiar with all the strategies the foundation is using.
Are you not familiar with the news stories that are coming out with respect to these allegations, sir?
I have
you not been privy to that?
Well, I have seen the news stories.
You haven't been speaking to current board members?
About this, no.
About this particular allegation?
No.
Okay. During your tenure, sir, there was some questionable activities surrounding your dismissal. Was this in relation to how poorly you handled this complaint?
I addressed this at the other committee. So let me talk about this for a second, if you don't mind, because this really goes to my reputation. There was an intimation at the committee that I was fired. The chair of the other committee asked Madame Fournier whether I was fired. She said, gee, I don't know. I would suggest that she knows very well. Here is what happened. I had a 4-year contract with the foundation that ended in 2018. I lived in Ottawa and was commuting back and forth. In April of 2017, more than a year before I was supposed to leave, I told the chair that I did not want to renew my contract. I had very good evaluations all through, and I gave him more than a year's notice because I wanted the foundation to have the opportunity to have a proper process to find a successor, which they did, and they found Madame Fournier to be the successor. Madame Fournier and I then had an opportunity of overlap for several weeks to get her accustomed to the foundation. So I was absolutely not fired. There was a very nice going away party for me, a very nice gift that I got from some of the directors.
Mr. Jenner, that's not necessary.
No, that's another gift.
Mr. Rosenberg, I appreciate the answer, and I'm sure we'll come back to this. I'm going to turn now to Ms. Yip. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses for coming. Mr. Rosenberg, did you want to finish any thoughts with the previous question?
Sometimes there are questions that come right at the end and I can't actually finish answering. I was not fired from the foundation. That is absolutely false. I chose the timing of my departure, and I tried to be as decent about it as I possibly could.
In your opening statement, you seem to mention that there was a donation in question that we're all talking about that was, it seemed positive, the intention, and to really foster a relationship with the Canadian government, which was the Harper government at that time, through supporting post-secondary studies. Could you provide any comment on that? And could you provide that letter that you had mentioned that you would be able to give us?
I will provide a copy of the letter. I don't know what the procedure is in this committee. In the other committee, I wasn't allowed to provide paper, but I will. I will say that the letter came off the website of the China Cultural Industries Association. If you go onto the website, you will find a lot of information including a whole bunch of congratulatory letters from people all over the world, but including a number of people in Canada, from the government of Quebec, for example, and there are others. I don't have a full list of them here. So, I mean, they were well known, and I don't deny that they had links with the government in China, but I think everybody understood that. We were dealing with, you know, a Chinese communist government, and from what I understand, whether it's Chinese state-owned corporations like the CNOOC Corporation that purchased Nexen Energy for $15 billion, that's not an independent private corporation. That is a corporation that's controlled by the Communist Party in China. So everybody had their eyes open to doing business with China. But we all felt back then that it was worth the trouble, given that China was the rising superpower in the world. And I think slowly, and it was slowly, we started to realize that this relationship was very difficult, that you started to see in the mid-2010s intellectual property theft, dual-use research that was being done, and questions about whether universities were being diligent enough in looking at these things. But at the same time, we were still doing cultural things with China. And even as late as 2017, I found an article in University Affairs by the rector at the University of Ottawa saying everybody should be doing research with China. In 2015, you've got UBC announcing a major research project with China. So I think it really took until the penny really dropped for us with the hostage taking, with the two Michaels. And then we realized, boy, you know, we're in a different world. This wolf warrior diplomacy, the way these people are treating the Uyghurs, the way they're dealing with Hong Kong, this is not what we thought we were dealing with. And I think it changed our perception.
Diaspora communities are unfairly stigmatized as a result of this debate, as people conflate Chinese Canadians and the PRC. What can we do to make a clear distinction and ensure that we are protecting all Canadians?
Well, I mean, I agree that this is a problem. And I think, first of all, there's got to be an opportunity for these people to be able to tell their stories. So whatever process comes out of these negotiations among the parties, I really hope that diaspora communities are given a voice. And I know that there's an association of people from Hong Kong who've been very vocal, but I think it's also true with respect to Iranian citizens and perhaps Indian citizens, and even expat Russians. Anybody who's got family left behind in an authoritarian state may be vulnerable to harassment because of what can be done to their families. These things need to be understood and looked at. It's not, though, and I think, you know, we also want to find ways of protecting them, and we protect them by being perhaps a bit more proactive than we have been on the issue, say, of the Chinese police stations. Now the government has started to do that and started to expel them and expel some of the diplomats, and we have to stand up for ourselves.
I'd like to ask all of you, during your time at the foundation, were donations received from any other foreign countries, and how was that handled?
I don't think any of my colleagues were at the foundation, so maybe I'll
Over to you,
answer
Mr.
the
Rosenberg.
question. Well, there were first of all, this was not a foreign donation, although we have a debate about that. The biggest foreign donation was from the chair of the foundation, John McCauley, who is a Canadian living in Geneva. His foundation is a Swiss-based foundation. There were some other smaller donations, nothing at all of this magnitude. Certainly
Thank you,
no
Mr.
other Chinese.
I'm going to leave it there because you answered the question and the time is expired. Madame, but it's something that we can come back to. Madame Sinclair-Desgagne, vous avez la parole pour 2 minutes 30 secondes.
Ms. Sinclair-Desgagne. Thank you, Chair. I would like to come back to my previous line of questioning. There's a major difference between your testimony and that of Ms. Fournier. Well, that's a first step. You've recognized that. Ms. Fournier indicated that there was communication between people based in China and the foundation on what to write down on the tax receipts. Are you aware of that? Yes, I am aware of that because of the fact that there are documents in the 160 pages. But at the time, were you aware of that? No, but you were CEO and you were not aware of the fact that your employees were receiving directives from Peking. No, I was not aware of that because, as I said, there were people at the foundation responsible for the entire donation and receipt process. And in my opinion, we did not have discussions on that. If you look at the documents, I was not even copied on the emails. Normally, were you supposed to know what your employees were doing? I think, once again, that's something that's essential when we are CEO. When, inaudible for the interpreter, if you are a director of an organization and you don't necessarily have employees, but lots of work, and we have to decide where to deploy our energy, we rely on our employees. Would you have found it acceptable for your employees to put different names when donations put names from Peking? It was 2 different names, and then on the tax receipt, other names were placed on the tax receipt. Well, you're saying that you are not aware of what they were saying. Would you have found that acceptable? Frankly, at that time, I did not have the opportunity and I did not think about that. For me, what was essential was that the receipt was done to the corporation that made the donation, even if it's a different name and something that is condemned by the CRA, let the CRA tell us, well, that's the law. You know that. You cannot receive a donation from someone and give the tax receipt to someone else. As a director, as a CEO, would you have condemned your employees? From what I understand, the receipt was issued to the person who made the donation, which was Millennium Golden Eagle Canada Inc. That's it. Thank you very much.
Half minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I want to also continue on something that Mr. Rosenberg, you just mentioned in previous regarding the relationship that the foundation had during your time there as CEO and the kind of nature of the government's intention with China. You mentioned that there was 2 examples, I think, that are fair to mention that you mentioned. One was former Prime Minister Harper's invitation to invite pandas as a symbol of goodwill, to a growing relationship. He also mentioned, of course, under that same regime and the Conservatives, the purchasing of assets of Canadian oil. And those are 2 examples, especially under the Conservative government, that would, of course, demonstrate the will of both the Conservatives and, of course, the operating government now of their intention to further develop a relationship with China. And you mentioned, of course, that was all turned on its head when 2 Michaels it became a situation, of course, devastating to Canadians, and a fact that may have been devastating, of course, to many folks within the civil service. In your experience, especially when you were there as president and CEO, you mentioned that it was part of the culture, let's say, of the government, and that the Trudeau Foundation was participating in that culture of trying to build a relationship with China. And you also mentioned that in your first round of questioning, that the government, when you accepted the Trudeau Foundation, when they accepted the donation, would have hosted a conference on something like Tiananmen Square, for example. That's something that you said in the testimony here. And just in light of that, wouldn't it have been enough for the Chinese, at least for that project, if they had seen that conference take place and then refused to donate to the Trudeau Foundation in the future, wouldn't that constitute a kind of jeopardization of the foundation's goals, particularly during the culture at that time?
That's a very hypothetical question, and I don't know, but I can tell you this. I would assume that the title of a conference would probably have been more neutral. We were doing this with the U of M Law School, University of Montreal Law School. They were very interested in the rule of law. So let's assume we had a conference on the rule of law, a neutral title.
You also said Uyghurs, though, Mr. Rosenberg.
Yeah,
I'm just confused. Your statement now, it seems to be a bit different than the nature of what you were trying to make a statement earlier. You may explain, but I want you to explain the difference of your 2 points here.
I'm going to explain that you can have a conference with a benign title, but there's no way, I know the people in the Trudeau Foundation, that if you were dealing with the rule of law, human rights would have come up, the Uyghurs would have come up, all sorts of stuff would have come up, and it would have resulted in the same thing. This was not a, if somebody in China thought that it was a good idea to build the Chinese brand in Canada to host or to pay for these conferences, I think they were mistaken. I think this would have come out in a very different way.
Thank you very much. That is the time. Turning now to Mr. Genuis. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Okay, thanks, Chair. I think it's maybe important to start by just underlining why we're here. It's because so much of the public is concerned, we are deeply concerned in the official opposition, that the Trudeau Foundation has a governance problem that led to it being targeted as a means to influence the Trudeau government. It's a matter of public record that the Minister of Industry as well as the Trudeau family have the ability to appoint members to the foundation, that this foundation is defined as a public institution in various statutes, and that there was a spike in foreign donations after the Trudeau government took office, and it stretches credibility to think that that was sort of an accident unrelated to the fact that the foundation shares a name with the person who's prime minister, or that the prime minister continues to be listed as a member in the foundation's annual report, though identified as an inactive one. But I particularly want to drill down on this issue of the meeting in the prime minister's office. Mr. Rosenberg, you've told us there's nothing unusual about this meeting. Hey, meetings happen in the Prime Minister's office all the time. No big deal. I'll let you respond. But the Prime Minister's office is actually the name of the building. It's called the Prime Minister's office, and that a meeting took place with the Trudeau Foundation. You said PCO also has offices. Look, and it's a central downtown location. So I know the building fairly well. The Prime Minister's office is a 4-story building and includes the Prime Minister's private office as well as other buildings. The political arm of PMO uses the vast majority of that building. There are some offices from PCO, but the building is adjoining the 10-story Blackburn building, which is, from what I understand, all PCO offices. Even if the meeting had to happen somewhere between Spark Street and Wellington, you've got 10 floors with presumably boardrooms on all of them in the Blackburn building, and you've got one floor that's used by PCO in the Prime Minister's office. And to say that, well, all the boardrooms were taken in the Blackburn building. There was no space anywhere else in downtown Ottawa. The only place available was PM. I mean, that's just malarkey, isn't it? I mean, you must have known that this meeting sent a message, and you must have intended it to send a message, sir. But tell me why none of the boardrooms in Blackburn building or anywhere else in downtown Ottawa were available, and you just felt this was the most convenient place to meet.
Well, there are a few things I want to say in response to your question. First of all, I believe that while this building is now called, I'm not sure exactly whether it's the Prime Minister's office.
The Prime Minister's office is what it's called.
I think, and the Privy Council
office. It was previously called Langevin Bloc, named after Mr. Langevin,
yes,
and the
when
name
was that changed?
But it was always the Prime Minister's office. It was,
Mr. Genuis, you're kind of.
Go for
why
it.
don't we hear from Mr. Rosenberg?
Yeah.
Okay. So I actually think at that time was before there was an issue around the name of the building. I think it had something to do with the legacy of Hector Langevin, maybe in relation to residential schools, I'm not sure. So a decision was made to change the name of the building. I think it may have still been the Langevin Bloc when I was there. 1. 2, I worked in PCO. They actually used 2 floors. The 3rd floor, where you've got the office of the clerk, the deputy secretary plans, the deputy secretary operations, the national security advisor is actually somewhere else, and that whole floor is filled with PCO folks. The 4th floor has 2 very big boardrooms and a number of smaller boardrooms that are constantly in use by members of the public service. 3rd, the genesis of this is I spoke to a deputy secretary of, I believe, of plans, and I think he would have said, I can't organize a meeting in the PCO. He said, well, I would have said, this is something you guys might want to know about, and he would have said, okay, I'll organize a meeting. Where do deputy secretaries of plans organize meetings? They do it in PCO, and they tend to do it in boardrooms on the 4th floor of the Langevin block.
I'm going to jump in. I got 30 seconds left. Those boardrooms are used extensively by the Prime Minister's own staff, and they have priority for booking those rooms.
Well, that may be true today,
that has always been the case. You have 10 floors in Blackburn, but moreover, you have all sorts of other buildings. Clearly, the public service is not unaware of the fact that when meetings take place in the Prime Minister's office, that sends a message. And if you want to send the message that this foundation is closely connected to the Prime Minister, and therefore donations to this foundation are appreciated by the Prime Minister, a great way to send that message is to have it in the relatively small building that is used and that is called the Prime Minister's office.
Thank you, Mr. Genuous. There was no question mark there. I will give you just, if you could keep it brief on Mr.
Fundamentally
Rosenberg.
disagree with that view. This is used by the PCO all the time, and I don't think it sends any message. And we were not the only ones to have the opportunity to go there.
Thank you very much. Ms. Shanahan, you have the time.
Thank you, Chair. And I can see what the objective is. This study, by the way, is taking place to look at the Trudeau Foundation precisely because it had been created with $125 million from the government at the time, and I understand not all the parties were in agreement with it, but to see what's happening at this time, basically a smear job on the Trudeau Foundation, I think is very shameful. I would like to address those meetings at the PCO. First of all, the difference between PMO and PCO, please, very briefly, Mr. Rosenberg.
Public service. It is the Prime Minister's department, but it is filled with public servants who generally have worked elsewhere to have a broader experience, then spend some time at the PCO, and then typically, it is a path to more senior jobs in the public service. I was the Deputy Secretary Operations in PCO before I became Deputy Minister of Justice, for example. And before that, I was the Assistant Secretary Economic and Regional Development Policy starting under the Conservatives at the end of the Mulroney and Kim Campbell regimes.
Now, you mentioned the Conservatives. Is there any criteria to be a member of one party or the other to be hired onto the PCO?
No. In fact, one of the things I would say that's really interesting is that a lot of the people who became deputy ministers under the Liberals had been political staff under the Conservatives. And they're some of the best deputy ministers. And I was always a big believer in hiring political staff. And under both different governments, I hired political staff from the other party. And I would.
Why was that?
Because I find that political staff actually have their feet firmly planted on the ground in terms of what's practical in a way that sometimes public servants don't.
Very, very interesting observation. Can I ask about that meeting in 2016? What was the context in which the Trudeau Foundation was discussed?
Well, the Trudeau Foundation wasn't discussed. What was discussed was it was really the beginning of a project that actually was being done jointly with the Centre for International Governance Innovation at Waterloo, CIGI, on whether there are economic benefits to innovation. And so we wanted to get a little bit of sharing with the government and also to have the possibility of these researchers to maybe speak to some folks, policy folks in the government about their information. And there was a study that was completed about a year later that really looked on kind of an industry by industry basis, because there were real distinctions from one industry to the other. And that study is available online. I could provide it, but you could equally find it.
Flack, because I believe you were present at the time at that meeting. Indeed, can you speak to that meeting concerning the Trudeau Foundation, and if there were any other meetings about the Trudeau Foundation and what was discussed?
I would have been invited to the meeting as the Deputy Minister of Canadian Heritage, which has, among its other things, a mandate for pluralism. What I remember about the meeting is it was a meeting with some academics on a project on pluralism. I probably would have gone back to the department and told the department, did we have eyes on this? Because there are many pluralism projects the department worked with the Race Relations Foundation, Canadian Centre for Pluralism. So that's my recollection of the meeting.
Was there any discussion whatsoever about dealings with China, about favoring China, Chinese academic research, anything of that nature, of any kind?
I have no recollection of anything like that. What I recall was an academic project on pluralism, not unlike the ones we did with the Global Center for Pluralism in Canada. But the meeting was 7 years ago. I think I would have remembered if there was something about China, but I don't have any recollection of anything like that. It was more a kind of standard academic conference that we were being made aware of, and the department had an interest in.
Very good. And I'd like to direct a question then to Mr. Newbley concerning Industry Canada. What is the mandate of Industry Canada vis-a-vis the Trudeau Foundation?
Yes, as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, the Trudeau Foundation is part of the portfolio of agencies that is in the department. Other agencies would include the Business Development of Canada, National Research Council, Space Agency, the Granting Council. So it's a broad range of different types of organizations. In the case of the Trudeau
and I'm afraid
Foundation,
that is we're over the time. That finishes our second round. Going back to Mr. Genuis, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. You know, what's striking to me is that someone who's had such senior roles in the public service would think the public in this committee are such utter fools as to believe that, oh, there was an interesting discussion about pluralism and economic growth. It was sort of an academic, open-ended, thought-provoking discussion. And it just happened to involve 6 deputy ministers and take place in the Prime Minister's office. There's a lot of think tanks in this country that are doing great and probably more sophisticated work on these issues than the Trudeau Foundation that aren't able to get 6 deputy ministers together in the Prime Minister's office. The fact that nobody thought that was sending a message about anything to anyone is so bizarre that I'm surprised we're hearing that as testimony. I do want to move back to the issue of the very serious issue of sexual assault and harassment allegations against people connected with the foundation. My colleague, Mr. Brock, was raising these issues before a Liberal MP tried to shut it down on a point of order, and it is striking that Liberals don't want to hear these questions. They talk a lot about feminism and holding people accountable, but they didn't even want to let Mr. Brock finish his line of questioning on this. So I want to pick this up. Mr. Rosenberg, in the case involving Sherry Smiley, did you testify in February in support of the Trudeau Foundation's desire to move that case to Montreal?
I testified in February, not in support. I was asked to testify by their lawyers, but my testimony was...
Right, by which lawyers?
By the Foundation's lawyers.
The Foundation's lawyers, okay.
But my testimony, if I recall it, was simply around factual issues as to where, for example, I would have signed the scholarship agreement for Ms. Smiley, where Ms. Smiley went to school, where the events took place, which was in Newfoundland. So, yeah, I mean, I just gave factual testimony. I wasn't advocating for anybody.
Naturally, as a witness, you wouldn't have, your role wasn't to advocate, but is it reasonable to presume that if the Foundation's lawyers asked you to testify, they thought the testimony you provide would be useful to their desire to move the location of the case to Quebec?
Yeah, I assume that's why they wanted me to. I'm not sure they would have found my testimony necessarily all that helpful.
Right. And do you think the way Ms. Smiley has been treated by the Foundation has been appropriate?
Can't say.
Well,
I don't know because I wasn't there. Most of this, as I understand it, statement of claim deals with issues post the time that I left the Foundation.
Okay, but they've repeatedly sought a change of venue. So I'm just on the face of that. I mean, I can't speak to the particular facts of her claim, but the repeated efforts to move the venue to a place where these events didn't occur and that is least convenient for her. Would you suggest that that's not a great way of kind of affirming the importance of survivors coming forward and telling their stories?
Mr. Genuis, and maybe through the chair, I am not going to opine on people's strategy in handling litigation.
My next question is about sort of a structural issue for the foundation around legal issues like this. Who pays for the litigation that occurs, and where does the money come from specifically for that litigation that the foundation uses?
From administrative budgets of the foundation.
Okay, is that donor money? Is that money interest on the endowment?
I don't think it's donor money, but I'm not sure. Frankly, you could ask the foundation what the accounting is on that.
Okay. I want to switch quickly to Mr. Nubley in the time I have. The Minister of Industry is responsible for appointing directors to the Trudeau Foundation. Could you share a bit about the process that you follow when you're DM at an industry regarding appointments to the Trudeau Foundation?
Several comments here. First, I believe there were changes, and I was briefed on this in 2013 in terms of the role of the minister in terms of appointments. And in 2013, under the Harper government, the foundation actually changed the appointment process so that in recognition that ministers would not appoint directors, the change as I understood it, although perhaps Mr.
Sorry, I am almost out of time, and I may have misspoke. It's members to the foundation. The minister, according to the latest annual report, retains the power to appoint members to the foundation. Are you aware of that? And can you tell us about the process by which the minister makes these decisions?
So that is the case. It is members, and I never participated in any appointment because, as I understood it, and I believe I'm correct on this, although I'm working again on my memory, that no appointments were ever made by Ministers Parody, Moore, or Baines.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fragiskatos, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Rosen.
Can I just take 30 seconds of your time to answer one issue that Mr. Genuis raised, where he said there were 6 DMs who went to this meeting. I think the only DM who went to this meeting, because they're all here, it's not 6, first of all, was Mr. Flack. I don't believe Mr. Zhang was there. I don't believe Ms. Biguzs was there, and I don't believe that Mr. Nubley was there. So as far as the clout of the foundation to get deputy ministers to come to meetings, and I'll tell you, if I was a deputy minister and I got that invitation, I probably wouldn't have gone either. Deputies are busy people. They tend to send people lower down in the organization. Sorry.
Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Rosenberg. I'm going to give you an opportunity, sir, to I think we're well over an hour into this meeting, and there's been a number of exchanges, and much has been said. I want to give you the chance to leave us with 2 or 3 key points that you want us to take away as members of this committee that, from your perspective, are crucial to this entire issue. Let's go back to basics, if I can put it that way.
Well, I mean, if we're talking about the entire issue, are we talking about the donation? I have a few things to say about that.
The key points that you want to leave us with.
Yeah.
I leave that in your hands.
I would just, there are a couple of things I would reiterate, as for using the donation bought no influence, and we never thought that a $200,000 donation would influence any government, as I've said. And as for using the foundation to spread a pro-China message, the donation likely would have resulted in conferences that were not what the Chinese wanted to hear, as I've already said. But I think that's a key message, and it goes to our motivation in terms of having thought that this was actually not something we needed to be concerned about. We didn't see how this was actually going to influence us, or how, frankly, the idea that $200,000 is going to influence any government, I think, is absurd. But, other people have different views. Second, in terms of whatever happened with the receding, it is so much against the interest of the Trudeau Foundation to do anything that would jeopardize its charitable status. So either we did it right, and if we didn't do it right, then, CRA should tell us that we didn't do it right. But as far as we were concerned, this donation was made by a company, and the receipt went to the company. I've already talked about the discrepancy between the annual reports and the receipts. Our motivation in this in dealing with the folks that we were dealing with is that they were known quantities. They had donated to the University of Toronto. They had been dealing with the University of Montreal for a long time. It was the U of M who brought us into this, and we didn't think that there was, and the Canadian ambassador in China was the one who introduced the University of Montreal to Mr. Zhang. So we thought from a due diligence point of view that we did our due diligence, and this was a donation that accorded with our priorities and allowed us and our scholars to learn about probably the biggest geopolitical issue over the past 30 years, which is the rise of China and its implications.
Mr. Rosenberg, the efforts made by conservative politicians continue in terms of trying to paint the organization as some type of conduit through which China was trying to gain influence over the Canadian government. I have not seen, and I don't think any member of this committee or any parliamentarian has seen evidence in that direction at all. However, perception, as you well know, is everything, not just in politics, but in terms of how the public perceives and looks at these issues. Will the foundation, which we've heard from you today and we heard from Mr. Johnson the other day about the very good work that it has done in terms of supporting students and research, do you think it will survive?
I hope it survives. I think this is a very fraught time for the foundation. I think dealing with the resignation of a president and a resignation of several board members, they have some work to do, and it's why, in answering Mr. Desjarlais' question earlier, I really hope that we can clarify this. There's been a lot of allegations made, a lot of smoke there. I honestly believe the foundation was operating in good faith, that it wasn't influenced. But I do understand that there are public perceptions out there. The foundation cannot wait 2 or 3 years to have this clarified. It needs a quicker resolution.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Et Madame Sinclair-Desgagne, vous avez la parole pour 2 minutes 30 secondes.
Ms. Sinclair-Desgagne, 3 minutes, 30 seconds. Thank you, Chair. I would like to come back to my previous line with Mr. Rosenberg. We were talking about the fact that your employees committed an act which, according to the law and CRA, could make you lose the status of a charity. I'm talking about the Trudeau Foundation. I am the one saying that. I do not agree. You don't agree with the fact that the foundation did not have the right to receive the donation from someone and to send a receipt to a company. It is the company that made the donation and the receipt was issued to the company. If there's any confusion on that, it may be something that should be cleared by an independent person or the CRA. But I'm asking you, Mr. Rosenberg, Mr. Johnson, for example, told us that documents were sent with banking information and receipts. If all those documents could be sent to us quickly, maybe the situation will be clarified. It's up to Mr. Johnson as president of the board of directors to do that. I do not have access to the foundation documents. I understand that, but at least you agree that we could look at those documents, and maybe you agree with that, because once again, what has been observed is that the donations were received from 2 specific donors in China, and the tax receipt was sent to Millennium Golden Eagle with clear directives from the Chinese government to the foundation. There are 2 ways of looking at it. It could be seen as something that is not a conspiracy, and something that is normal in another way. Unfortunately, there's a lot of confusion, and it's going to take expertise, the documents, and some expertise on taxation to determine what happened. Afterwards, you could talk about the conspiracy theory if you wish, but right now there's something that is called the law, and you know it very well because you are a lawyer. When it's clearly stated by law that tax receipts should go to a donor with the same name, it's simple. It's white or black. It's not about the conspiracy theory. Well, I won't talk about that. When there are allegation theories against you. Your time is up, Ms. Sinclair-Desgagne.
You have the floor for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for the witnesses for being present here again. I'm not certain, just Mr. Chair, on a point of clarification, if I can just have my time restored. How many rounds are we having?
I think you'll get you should get another one after this, Mr. Desjarlais.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Rosenberg, you mentioned in your answer to some of our Liberal colleagues the nature of some of your operations, both in between the period of when you were the CEO of the Trudeau Foundation and, of course, when you were Deputy Minister. And you spoke about, some of the practices you engaged in as a Deputy Minister for the government, in particular in response to the question of partisanship of Conservative staff members and Liberal staff members. You mentioned that there was an aptitude for both of those parties to be affiliated with the government, even if they weren't part of the governing party, and that you hired them. And so in part of our study here, investigating the Trudeau Foundation, I believe it's important to talk about some of the corporate culture practices. I find that as a new member of Parliament, there is a great difference between many of the party's cultures. And in particular, I have seen in the past this tradition between both Liberals and Conservatives of having staff members, in particular partisan staff members, go between both, and oftentimes between organizations they're also affiliated with. During your time as the CEO of the Trudeau Foundation, did you also employ staff members of the Liberal and or Conservative Party?
I don't think so, to my knowledge. It's not that I wouldn't have, but not because they were Liberals or Conservatives. But as far as I know, the staff at the foundation was pretty apolitical.
But in terms of your work as the Deputy Minister, you've identified credibility in that assertion of hiring staff members from both the Liberals and Conservatives. And so understanding that, sorry?
It's a different job. Credibility in the context of the government.
Oh, it's not a different job, as a matter of fact, Mr. Rosenberg. You've just heard testimony today as you're in Parliament right now as to an investigation of foreign interference and the participation of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation. Mr. Rosenberg, it's not out of the question or unreasonable to ask the question of why or how members of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation and the members of these parties are connected. It's not unreasonable. And to say that they're apolitical, especially since you've just given testimony to the fact that as a Deputy Minister, you did that. And so, Mr. Rosenberg, let me ask again, and I'd hope you can see how serious this is. And I know you're smiling right now, but I need to have the credibility of your remarks to understand how the Trudeau Foundation and its culture and the connection it has with Canadian partisanship to the point of foreign interference could exist. I need you to answer the question as to if you don't know.
Thank you, Mr. Desjarlais. I'm going to let Mr. Rosenberg provide an answer.
Sure of the question. Are you asking me whether staff at the foundation were politically affiliated? The answer, as far as I know, is no.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Turning now to Mr. Cram, you have the floor for 5 minutes. I'm sorry, Mr. McCauley. You have the floor for 5 minutes, Mr. McCauley. Pardon me.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, witnesses, for being with us today. I just want to chat just quickly, Mr. Rosenberg, to follow up on Mr. Desjarlais' comments about the partisanship. How many, besides obviously Chuck Strahl, how many known Conservatives were you aware of that worked for or were members?
Michael Fortier was a member, was a mentor rather. The original board had, Bill Davis on it. I'd have to go back and look. There were also NDP members on it.
It's pretty minimal compared. So I think what I'm saying, I don't think anyone considers, well, known from the Bloc, but I don't think anyone would look at the foundation and say, oh, that's purely a nonpartisan one. I want to get back to the original donation. When the 140,000, 70,000 came through, the foundation was aware that some of it was coming directly from mainland China, were they not?
No, the foundation was aware that the check or whatever it was deposited into the Bank of Montreal by a Canadian corporation, Millennium Golden Eagle Canada, Inc.
And no one was aware there was any link to mainland China or the PRC?
If anyone, I think the people who were looking at the receipting...
Next question is when was the foundation aware?
The whole issue of, this link to the PRC, we knew we were dealing with Chinese individuals, but we also knew that and this is where all the confusion comes in, my understanding is that people sometimes use corporations to make donations for them. People control corporations, and they'll decide for whatever reason to use the corporation.
Was there like no suspicion? No, this really doesn't.
You know, we weren't suspicious, I guess, partly because we didn't think there was anything to this that was asking us to do anything untoward. As I said, we basically had a free run with what we were going to do with this money.
But you weren't getting. No one was stepping forward before then, saying, "Here's $140,000. Send the receipt off to China." It didn't happen till after.
It didn't really get picked up. And if you look at the documents that are there, there's correspondence between 2 employees in the foundation without ever CCing me or even the executive director.
Time in your 4 years, did you like, oh, this doesn't smell right?
I didn't, because of the nature of how we were introduced to these folks, their antecedents in having donated to the University of Toronto, the fact that, you know, the ambassador, our ambassador knew them, and the fact that, you know, these conferences, the only right they had was that the conferences would bear their names. The content of the conferences was not up to them.
Looking back, do you think you were just naive, perhaps willfully blind to this?
You know, I don't think so. I know there are different, you know, people have said there are perceptions out there, and I appreciate that, and I feel bad about it, because I think the foundation, you know, has been so tarred by this. But this is, you know, in the grander scheme of things, with all the things that we were doing, this was not a huge deal within the foundation. We were, you know, in the process of putting on these major conferences. Most of our energy was going into that and not thinking through this. You know, and there was a ceremony, and it was unusual to have a ceremony, but it was the University of Montreal who wanted to have the ceremony. And, you know, we decided that Alexander Trudeau would be appropriate to be there. It just was a kind of a strain. It was just a slightly different way of doing things.
Are there any, in your tenure, was there any CRA audits done?
I don't believe so, and I think the CRA actually answered that when they were here.
No, they didn't, and they were quite clear about not answering anything. So, Commissioner Hamilton, if you're watching right now, that's directed at you. You mentioned about the quote. You said, you know, the importance of maintaining, or you wouldn't jeopardize the charitable status. From looking back, you know, obviously there's the donation, but there's also the CNCA requirements. Apparently, were not done for years, as well as the disbursement obligations. Also, apparently, were not done. Are these perhaps just a disagreement in how the accounting should have been done?
As far as I know, the disbursement obligations, the percentage is what you're talking about there. When I was there, I believe we complied.
And I'm not trying to be difficult,
I am pretty sure, but I can't say definitely because I don't have the documents.
Thank you very much. Turning to now Ms. Bradford, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for giving up your time today to appear before our committee. Since a lot of the focus has been on Mr. Rosenberg, I want to make it worth the while for some of the other witnesses who have appeared for us today. So, Ms. Biguzs, you're retired from the Federal Public Service. There hasn't been a lot of reference to that today about their involvement. When did you retire?
I retired in June of 2016.
June of 2016. Okay, and what was your role in the Federal Public Service?
My last position was as the Deputy Minister of Immigration, so I believe that was why I was invited to appear as a witness to this committee meeting today. But I'd had a 35-plus year career in the Federal Public Service, working in a number of different departments, but also 2 central agencies, including the Privy Council Office and also the Treasury Board Secretariat.
And did you have any involvement with the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation?
No, I did not.
In your work? Okay, so you were probably somewhat confused as to why you were asked to attend.
Well, my understanding, when I received the invitation from the clerk, it was in relation to a meeting that took place in April of 2016, so 2 months before my retirement, and that my department, I had been included in that invitation for that April 2016 meeting. was a meeting that took place 7 years ago, and I do not recall, to the best of my knowledge, that I actually even attended the meeting. It may have been something that I delegated, but was because I don't have access to documents, I don't have access to agendas. I did verify with my former colleagues in my office, my chief of staff, my associate deputy, whether they could recall whether I attended the meeting or whether it was delegated. So to the best of my knowledge, I have no real knowledge of the meeting itself.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so now turning to Mr. Flack. What role does the PCO play in facilitating conversations between departments and organizations seeking research and other post-secondary funding?
Normally, it wouldn't be that the Privy Council Office plays a role in trying to seek funding for the organizations or facilitate that. I'd say the PCO role, particularly in the plans role, the Deputy Secretary Plans, would be on major issues confronting the country. It would be common practice to bring together external players, could be from the business community, could be from the academic community, to have a discussion with senior officials around those issues.
You didn't have any involvement in facilitating that meeting that happened in 2016?
It would have been the Privy Council Office who would have set up the meeting.
Okay, and now, Mr. Nubley, how do departments work with organizations like the Trudeau Foundation to provide post-secondary funding for research and other use?
Sorry, can you ask that again?
How do departments work with organizations like the Trudeau Foundation to provide post-secondary funding for research and other use?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. What I can speak to is that there is a relationship between the industry department, or ISED, and the Trudeau Foundation. That relationship is that they are part of the portfolio of agencies, of which there are many in the department. I mean, other departments like Heritage, for example, have large portfolios, like I said. In the case of the Trudeau Foundation, they are obviously part of it because they are promoting scholarship and excellence in academic activity, which is a focus of the, as I mentioned in my remarks, the science sector in the department. There is a conditional agreement between the department and the foundation, and that specifies some of the issues to be discussed. And the main one, as that's been mentioned, is this issue of ensuring that the Trudeau Foundation only spends interest in terms of its activities.
Thank you for that. Mr. Rosenberg, I don't want to ignore you completely. So during your time working with the foundation, did you witness any attempts to seek political patronage or influence through any donations to the foundation?
No.
No.
That is your time, Ms. Bradford. Turning now, we're going to try to get through one more round. Mr. Cram, I believe you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Rosenberg, you were named President and CEO of the Foundation in 2014. And then October of 2015, you found yourself with the Foundation having the same last name as the new Prime Minister. Can you, share with the committee any steps or safeguards that you put in place to limit any donations that could be, or at least perceived to be, a conflict of interest?
Well, first of all, Mr. Trudeau had not had any dealings with the foundation since before I became the president, and there was a letter from him that I believe came in December 2014 saying that he essentially recused himself, kind of, created a, almost like a blind trust. He wouldn't be involved for the rest of his time in politics. And there were no specific policies put in place, if that's what you want to know. But as his brother said when he testified at the Access to Information Committee, we were very mindful of not doing anything with him, and even his own brother was very mindful of that.
But there are two directors of the foundation who are appointed by the Trudeau family, correct?
That's the structure that was put in place when the foundation was set up and when the funding agreement was put in place.
Okay, now you said earlier that you did not think that a $200,000 donation or a $160,000 donation could be used to buy influence. So are there any limits to donations to the Trudeau Foundation?
Well, I don't think we ever got a donation that would have tested that. The biggest donation we ever got was from the McCauley Foundation. And as I said, John McCauley, who is probably one of the leading philanthropists in Canada, just gave $200 million to McGill, gave $100 million to Oxford, gave us $3 million. That's about, by far, many orders of magnitude bigger than anything else we'd ever gotten.
Okay. Do you know what the limits are for donating to a politician's election campaign?
No, I don't.
Okay, it's less than $2,000 in this country. So I am excuse me, I'm a bit surprised that $200,000 did not that you could imply that $200,000 would not be significant enough to buy influence in the Canadian political system, given that when the MPs around this table are running for re-election, we cannot accept, it's actually less than $2,000. So it's troubling that these checks and balances would not be in place for the Trudeau Foundation.
Apples and oranges, though, isn't it? I mean, there are individual campaign contribution limits for people running, for office. $200,000 to the Trudeau Foundation on a base endowment of $125 million that was growing was not that big a deal.
Hey, but if someone wants to donate $200,000 to Justin Trudeau's election campaign, and soon finds out that the contribution limits are less than $2,000, I think it would be pretty reasonable for someone to go to Google and say, well, what else can I donate to that has the same last name as the Prime Minister that could be used to purchase influence? So wouldn't you agree that the Trudeau Foundation would come up pretty quickly on a Google search?
Honestly, I don't think so. I mean, I really don't think that the $200,000 was either going to buy influence with us for all the reasons I've said, or influence with the government. I think, if you want to look at influence with the government, look at some of the other bigger deals. $15 billion, and I don't mean to pick on the Harper government, but there were these deals that were done. I don't. Well, these are facts, okay?
Point of order, Chair.
You want to talk
just
about
one sec, Mr. Rosenberg. I have a point of order.
As Mr. Polyev talks about
Mr. Rosenberg, just 1 second, gentlemen. Yes. Yeah.
The witness is simply trying to finish his statement.
Yes,
Chair, can we allow him to do that?
That's what I'm attempting to do. Yes. Mr. Rosenberg, you have the floor, and there's 40 seconds left in this.
I mean, there's so much. There's so much politicization on this issue. Some of you guys talk about the Beijing-funded Trudeau Foundation. What's actually not the Beijing-funded Trudeau Foundation. I could say the Beijing-funded deal to buy Nexon. I don't know. I honestly don't think that $200,000 is very significant in the greater scheme of things.
A couple of things very quickly. So prior to becoming Prime Minister, there was the ongoing issue of Justin Trudeau's speaking fees at different charitable events. Did the Trudeau Foundation ever pay Justin Trudeau to speak for a speaking fee at an event?
Not to my knowledge. I'd be very surprised.
And that is the time, I'm afraid. Turning now to Mr. Sidhu. Online, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
My colleague, Ms. Shanahan, will be taking this up.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Sidhu. I'd like to come back to a statement that you made earlier, Mr. Rosenberg, concerning worrying signs about China intentions in the 2010s. Can you expand on that?
Yes, I'll try a little bit. So people may remember back to 2010, actually, when the former head of CSIS made some statements about foreign influence. Some of that may have been Chinese influence. Create a bit of a hue and cry. Certainly the Liberals who were in opposition at that time were very unhappy about that. I think they even had Mr. Fadden at committee. Mr. Fadden didn't apologize for those statements, and I think time has proved that he was right. I think the government of the day did apologize for Mr. Fadden. Mr. Fadden happily went on to have a very good career, and he's very, very astute on matters of national security. But at that time, I don't think anybody or enough people were taking it that seriously. And so subsequently, you had things like, this letter to the Chinese Cultural Industry Association, and a lot of, and they were doing a lot of PR, not just in Canada, but all over the world. And so we were in a period of warming relations with China. But then a number of things started to happen. I think people started to realize that they're not playing fair. They're in the World Trade Organization, but they're actually, using every loophole to their advantage. Trade with China is not necessarily fair trade. There was criticism of some of the agreements that were entered into with China. Concern, for example, that a customs agreement would have given them too much commercially sensitive information if they were, interested in appropriating some of our information. So I think the initial period, the concerns were more on the commercial side, on the economic side, and on the dual use of technology side, the military potential uses of technology, where you had Canadian universities working in collaboration with Chinese researchers. It took a while for us to get there, and I think it's only been fairly recently that universities have changed their policies on these things with the encouragement of the granting councils.
How would you characterize the response of the government at the time? Would you say that Prime Minister Harper at the time was being naive?
No, I think, I'm just to prove I'm not biased, I think that everybody at that time was working in what they thought was Canada's best interest. The whole world was courting China, whether it was businesses, academic institutions, and governments. So when the government of Canada entered into a customs agreement and entered into a foreign investment protection agreement with China, it thought it was working in the best interests of Canada. When the ambassador writes a letter to this cultural organization, he thought he was working in the best interests of Canada. Were we naive? I don't know.
Yep. Thank you for that. And I'd like to turn to Mr. Zhang because, Mr. Zhang, you were a national security advisor. Can you talk about that time and the evolution of the Canadian response to China?
I'm happy to do so, and I can add some, I think, some interesting facts. Like, for example, in 2012, we signed the Foreign Investment Protection Agreement with China. We did not ratify it until 2014. And there was a lot of media controversy when it was ratified, because part of the reason it wasn't ratified for 2 years were environmental concerns, labor concerns, but also the whole concerns are on state-owned enterprise. When we go back to the Nixon deal, you have to remember that it forced us to come up with a policy. In 2014, China, and we attributed it to China, attacked the National Research Council. A couple months later, they were arresting 2 Canadians in a very arbitrary way, Kevin and Julia Garrett, that were detained for several months. Several months later, Prime Minister Harper did go to China. He worked in enhancing the economic thing, but at the same time, he had the tough conversations about some of the things we didn't like about China. Just to go back on the NRC cyber attack, remember that we attributed to China the day before John Baird was meeting his counterpart Minister Baird, in Beijing. So this evolution that Mr. Rosenberg has described is very much so. It's not that they were naive or we're naive. More and more we realize that under Xi Jinping, we were dealing with a very, very challenging country. And one very important fact on this is what Mr. Rosenberg has described, what we call economic security, or sensitive technology, or research and all that. We were one of the first countries to start to invest heavily in protecting this. The statistic, when you look at Investment Canada Act transactions, show that every year. And we were partnered with other countries looking at that. So it's an evolution. When I appeared at PROC, I said, this is not a switch that's on and off. You have no interference, and you have interference overnight. it's something that happens overnight.
Thank you very much.
Merci.
So I've had members from both the government bench and the official opposition kind of signal me that the bells are ringing. I'm aware of this, and members love throwing point of orders at me that actually aren't point of orders. This is a point of order, so I will raise it now. We have. This is an actual point of order that anyone could have raised at any time. We've got 19 minutes till the votes. If we hear our last 4 questioners, that will take 15 minutes. Do I have UC to proceed? Yes, thank you. If you don't interrupt me, then I assume we do have that. But you are of course free to raise that point of order. Madame Sinclair-Desgagne, vous avez la parole pour 2 minutes 30 secondes. Merci.
Merci. Thank you, Chair. Let me summarize. Mr. Rosenberg, do you think that the 2 donors, Mr. Gencheng Yu and Mr. Zhang Ping, who, in your opinion, did not speak English well enough, and you were even obliged to thank them in Mandarin, there was a noble desire for the Trudeau. Do you think that they were simply concerned about the well-being of the fellows? That's what we thought, because that's what they did at the University of Toronto. Interruption by the questioner. I understand that that's not a good explanation. You, at that point, should have reacted and not signed tax receipts that were being sent to another company, because once again, this is against the Taxation Act. As CRA had said, they came to the Public Accounts Committee. This is an act that could ensure that the Trudeau Foundation lose its charitable status. For you who had been CEO for 4 years, a charity that uses 40% of its money to pay its leaders, whereas that number is 14% in Quebec. What do you say to that? I do not have figures before me. Inaudible for the interpreter. I don't know. You are talking about resources. There are some organizations that are higher and others that are lower. At this point, I can't say if there's any good justification for that at the Trudeau Foundation. The Trudeau Foundation is indeed a small organization. I don't know if the situation has changed. I'm not aware of the situation at the Trudeau Foundation after I left. I would like to ask one last question. Now, this falls in line with my first question. Now, let's come back to the donations. I wonder if you asked yourself that question, or whether you thought this was a noble objective when those 2 people wanted to make a donation. Why did you not wonder about that? Was it not your job as a CEO to make sure that the foundation had to maintain a certain reputation and not accept donations from people who clearly were using the name Trudeau to influence the Prime Minister who had just been elected? You have said clearly, I do not agree with you at all. I think that considering the nature of the donation and the fact that there were no conditions associated with the type of conferences that had to take place, we received this donor who was introduced to Mr. Lefebvre at the University of Montreal by our ambassador in Beijing. We thought it was a good thing to do. There you go. Thank you.
Desjarlais, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I do want to address my questions to Mr. Zhang in relation to his testimony just in previous and the facts that he presented. Of course, there's a narrative here, and it's a narrative of an experience that you and many of the witnesses here today have been able to piece together for us, and one that I think is an important piece to how we understand foreign interference, particularly by state actors like China, but even other state actors like Russia. Even in your experience, Mr. Zhang, I know you have served as the intelligence advisor to the Prime Minister during a time when these policies may have been shifting very quickly. You mentioned about the volatile movement of position, and we actually heard from Mr. Rosenberg about even civil society, the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation seeking to get these donations from China and to find ways to participate in a better relationship. He mentioned For example, as Mr. Rosenberg did as the former executive director, or CEO, that there is even witnessing the government take in pandas and other items like this to try to build this relationship. During your time and during this kind of narrative, did you see this as a risk that was taken seriously enough at that time to actually call for a public inquiry then? And do you think that was even something that Canadians were at that time even interested in?
So that's something that I've covered at PROC quite in depth when I appear. We were just starting to see signs of concerns. We were seeing a lot more signs on the economic security side, and I just spoke about it 2 minutes ago, so I'll spare time on this. But like, for example, in the summer of 2015, when I was Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, just a few months before the election, we issued a diplomatic note to all diplomatic missions, putting them on advice that they should not get involved in elections, knowing that the election was going to come soon, as per the Vienna Convention. We were heavily criticized, a little bit like Mr. Fadden in 2010. We were heavily criticized. Well, few people criticized us for doing that. They felt it was rude. We were seeing signs that some people from foreign countries were trying to intercede at the local level, not to what the extent has been described in those leaks that you've been seeing, but enough to say that an ounce of prevention is worth. So we issued that diplomatic release, and we did that. We worked very hard on the economic security side. I spoke to you about that. We saw we first had an attack on the World Anti-Doping Agency in 2016 in Canada, and 3 months after, the same GRU officer did the attack on the US election. And as is often the case in our society, the shiny object is always what is in the paper. So a lot of the attention was on cyber foreign interference. And we did a lot of work, and that's what led to a lot of the mechanisms that you're reviewing in your work on this. We did a lot of work to say foreign interference may happen both in cyber and analog war, so you need to be equipped for both.
Thank you very much. Mr. James, you have the floor for 5, and I will be strict on the time for you and for the government's last question round. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I do think it's important to put on the record that the Harper government was extremely cautious on China after the Nixon deal. They put in additional limitations on investments, and throughout the Harper years, they were getting pressured by the then opposition Liberals to be less cautious and more full steam ahead. So, I mean, I think it's fair to have a discussion about what aspects of those policies could have been different. But it's not as if there was no daylight between the Liberal and Conservative positions at the time. Conservatives took a very different approach, a much more cautious approach. And when the Liberals came into power, they were talking not only about free trade with China, but about an extradition deal with China. And that was after the arbitrary detention of the Garretts, the arbitrary detention of Hussein Khalil, and others. So I'm glad the detention of the Michaels ended up being a wake-up call, but frankly, it wasn't the first, nor will it sadly be the last case of arbitrary detention. And this Liberal government coming into office in 2015 should have known better. Mr. Rosenberg, you said something about the ambassador in China introducing these donors to the Trudeau Foundation. Could you share which ambassador that was and when that introduction took place?
Sorry, first of all, he introduced the donor to the Vice Rector International at the University of Montreal. It was the University of Montreal that approached the Trudeau Foundation.
Which ambassador was that?
Ambassador Guy Saint-Jacques.
Okay, thank you. We know that donors attended a Cash for Access fundraiser with Prime Minister Trudeau shortly prior to that donation going forward. Were you aware that those donors had attended a Cash for Access Liberal fundraiser?
I had no idea.
Okay. Would it have given you pause if you had known?
Maybe.
Okay. Were there others at the foundation that were aware or should have been aware, such as the Prime Minister's brother, that these donors were present at that fundraiser?
The Minister's brother, I think, testified that he and the Prime Minister, did not talk about politics. So yeah, I don't think he was aware either. It was
if I remember right, he was aware of their attendance. At least he was when he testified. And you're sort of unwilling to commit one way or the other about whether the fact that these donors attended a Cash for Access fundraiser right before they gave this money. You're sort of unwilling to commit on whether that would have given you pause. Or
we didn't know at the time, If somebody had told me that that had happened, I think that it would have given me some pause. It certainly would have done further investigation. I'm not saying it would have scuttled the whole thing.
So knowing what you know now, it does look like this was oriented towards trying to have an influence, correct?
Sorry, I'm not going to agree with you on that, and I'll tell you why.
They attend this fundraiser, and then they give the donation shortly afterwards.
Because this donation had been negotiated long before this fundraiser. It was ready to be
right, but it was finalized.
Announced. Sorry, it was ready to be announced in September of 2015, and it wasn't because of a technical issue with the University of Montreal part of this.
Right.
So
there's just a lot of technical issues and convenience, right? Like the shortage of boardrooms in Blackburn. Like it just so happened he was at this fundraiser before, and it was convenient time to finalize the donation afterwards. Like I don't think this is remotely credible. I do, in this time I have left, want to go back again to Mr. Nubley. I was interested in the fact that you went from being a deputy minister to working for McKinsey. So I want to ask if there was a cooling off period between your time in government and your time with McKinsey, and also if McKinsey has ever done work for the Trudeau Foundation.
Sorry, on the latter point, I have no idea, no knowledge of what McKinsey has done with the Trudeau Foundation, and it's inappropriate to speak of clients. I think I'll start with a statement that I've followed with since leaving government.
Sir, it would be appropriate to speak of it since you've been asked at a parliamentary committee. If you don't know, you don't know, but you do need to answer the question if you do.
I just said I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
And I was about to say that I have followed all of the governing rules related to the Lobbying Act and the Integrity Act as required in all my consulting activity. I joined McKinsey as a senior advisor in September 2020, which was more than 1 year after I left government in June 2019.
Yeah,
and that is a requirement that I cannot.
You advise them on how to get business with the government of Canada, sir?
Turning now to our last question.
No, I did not.
W.
No, I did not. And I want to say that I spent 5% of my consulting time working with McKinsey. And the reason I left
I believe you have the last 5 minutes,
September 2023 was
Mr. Nubley, we've moved on now. Thank you very much. Ms. Yip has the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Mr. Nubley, if you want to finish your sentence, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say two things. One is in my consulting work as a senior advisor, about 5% of my work time was with McKinsey. And I left because there was no work.
Thank you. And I'd now like to return back to what we are studying. Mr. Rosenberg, we have heard from Edward Johnson about the governance measure in place at the foundation. Could you tell us the procedures in place during your time and if there were any red flags raised by accountants or auditors regarding the donations?
As far as I know, there were no. We have I think PricewaterhouseCoopers was the auditor of the foundation, and I don't recall there ever being a red flag about it.
So you mentioned you were aware of a forensic audit being done. What would such an audit reveal?
Well, I'm aware that this is all based on what I heard here from Mr. Johnson. So you may know as much as I do about that. And I think you're better to ask Mr. Johnson what the content of that, or ask the forensic auditors themselves.
So you've mentioned today that the foundation's issues needed to be reviewed very quickly. Can you elaborate what the impact would be if it was not attended to quickly?
Well, I'm concerned at this point. The foundation needs to find a new president. And I think it'll be challenging to find a new president until these issues are clarified. I think the same is true with respect to finding new board members. And that's why I think it has to be done quickly. And it's really, I really, like Mr. Johnson, would hate to see the good work of the foundation, because I think it's done some fabulous work over the past 20 years, not be able to continue because of this.
It would certainly impact the recipients.
Absolutely.
What are some other ways Canadians can support the foundation?
Well, maybe I'll turn it around and say there are ways that the foundation can support Canadians, and I've talked about this a little bit. The foundation, under my time, and I think to some extent under Madame Fournier's time as well, has done much more of getting its members out into communities and familiarizing themselves with what is actually going on, but also familiarizing Canadians with the work of the foundation and giving, sort of allowing some young people who might otherwise never have thought of it the opportunity to dream that maybe they could do something like this too.
Since we're near the end here, are there any other remarks or comments that you would like to make?
No, I think I've said enough.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Yip, for yielding your time. That will give members a few more seconds to get to the votes. I do want to thank all the witnesses for appearing today, for responding to the committee's request you attend, and Mr. Rosenberg in particular for all the questions you answered today. On that, I will suspend the meeting, or pardon me, I will adjourn the meeting. We'll see you all Thursday.